Imagine it is 1984 and transplant yourself to the Sinai Peninsula. We are standing in a lot on the border between Israel and Egypt. Egypt has only taken control of the Sinai in the last couple of years. We are on our way to Mount Sinai. The trip will take a couple of days. On this trip, we will stop and hike through the deep wadis, the deep riverbeds in the desert. It's August. It's hot. It's sweltering. There's no vegetation. And the earth seems brown, but as you hike through the wadis, the colors of the walls in these riverbeds are red and purple and striations of green. At night, we stop. We pull out our sleeping bags and we lay down under the stars. The stars are brilliant. The constellations are clearer than you've ever seen them before. And the moon is so bright, it is hard to sleep. One wishes that one had blinders. It is just blinding. And we experience in some small way what the Bedouins who have lived there and traveled across the desert for millennia just know. The beauty of the sky, the constellations at their most clear, and the desert as it speaks to you of the presence of the glory of the Almighty. After some days, we traveled to the base of Mount Sinai. And at this base sits a monastery, the monastery of St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's is one of the oldest monasteries, working monasteries in existence. Housed in this monastery is one of the oldest libraries, and in it are codices that people travel thousands of miles to look at and study. Also housed within the walls of this monastery and the sanctuaries, from floor to ceiling, are the most incredible icons by Rublev that you've seen copies of, and the oldest known copy of Christ's Pantocrator. The icon of Christ the Pantocrator is about this big. And what is unusual about this picture, this depiction of our Holy Father, is the idea that one side of the face is sort of stern and judgmental, and the other side of his face is forgiving and loving. The two sides of God, the judge and the love. In 1984, there is nothing around St. Catherine's. There aren't hotels and swimming pools. There's nothing there but the hostel that belongs to St. Catherine's. And again, we sleep in the desert and stare at the sky, and the moon is blinding. For thousands of years, people of all nations, peoples from the Book of the Rock, have come to Mount Sinai, to climb Mount Sinai, to feel the presence of the God, and just to feel the vastness of the desert. You wake up in the morning to climb Mount Sinai. You wake up at 3 a.m. before it's light. You start up the well-worn path with your torch to mark your way. And as you rise to the top, the sun glimmers up over the mountains. And the stillness is in awe. And you're there, maybe you're there to see a glimpse of what maybe Moses saw at the top. Or maybe you're there to make your own journey, just to feel what it's like to climb these ancient trails where millennia, thousands have climbed before you. Your heart is moved by this place. Your heart is moved by this place where people have worked, prayed, toiled, and wept. And in it you feel the presence of the Lord, even amongst all the other pilgrims that have come here. This holy site speaks to you through its very existence. So what do these ancient walls and these paths and this pilgrimage through the desert have to do with our passage today? Well, in our reading from Exodus, the description that comes to us just before our reading, we are given the picture of what's happening. The Israelites, the nation that Moses has brought this far, has an encampment at the bottom in the desert. And outside of this encampment is the tent of meeting. And they describe how Moses would make these trips and walk through the village out to the tent of meeting and go in and chat with God. And it says that he talked with God face to face like a friend. And every time he would do so, a cloud, a pillar, would stand at the entrance, a little bit like a do not disturb sign. I'm in having a discussion with God. And the other thing that would happen is the inhabitants of the settlement would come and stand in front of their tents as Moses passed by, and they would worship God. I like to imagine that the prayers that they said were similar to our own morning prayers. Or maybe they were the prayers of the ancients that the Jewish people say in their synagogues on Saturday mornings that have been passed down through the rabbis. But the prayers are similar. They're prayers of asking God to be with them, to hear them, to be present. So here we are in this particular moment. This is a very particular conversation. And in our text today, we are zeroing in on one particular conversation that God and Moses are having together. And in this conversation, Moses points out to the Lord that you have commanded me. You've commanded me to bring up this people. And Moses is reminding God that he said to Moses, you know me and that I've found favor in your sight. And then Moses reminds God that these are his people. This is his nation. And he's demanding that God keep his promises and to go with them and be present with them. And Moses is protesting. If you're not going to do this, then I just want to stay here. I don't want to go anywhere. If you don't keep this promise, then let us just stay here. Otherwise, I have no way of telling you how I've met your demands. You haven't shown me what to do. And furthermore, I don't know how to tell the people that we've found your favor. Please show us. And God answers Moses. And what does he say to him? He says, I will be with you. I will lead you. You have found favor in my sight. But then Moses goes further in this back and forth and in this negotiation he's having with God. At the end of it, he implores God further. He demands of God one more bold thing. And he says to the Lord, show me your glory. And the Lord answers Moses by telling him he will show him his goodness, not his face, not his full visibility. Well, this is a very interesting statement. Here is God telling Moses that his goodness will pass before him. We are left to ponder this idea of God's goodness, that God's goodness will pass before us, that he will show his goodness to us. But it's interesting the way God tells Moses this. He uses the phrasing, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. This is familiar words. It's familiar territory. We've heard this before. We've heard this in Exodus 3:14, where Moses asked God to tell him who sent him. Tell me your name. And God says to Moses, I am who I am. Tell them, I am sent you. In both these instances, God tells Moses that you cannot hear my name or see my face and live. That his radiance is beyond the ability to survive. The familiar phrasing lets us know that this is God speaking. So then God explains to Moses how he will show his glory to him. Exodus doesn't describe how Moses gets to the cleft of the rock, but we know that they are encamped in the desert, and in amongst the desert are the mountains and the valleys and the clefts of the rocky desert terrain. And God says, I will place you in the cleft of a rock, and I will pass by. The way he describes it is that he will place Moses in this cleft and put his hand in front of him and protect him from the magnificence of God. And as he passes by, he will remove his hand and Moses will see his back. Robert Alter, a theologian, said, the afterglow of the effulgence of his presence is what God is showing Moses. The effulgence is a radiance that's so powerful, it's blinding. God is allowing Moses to see as much of his radiance as he can live and survive seeing. I find in this encounter a number of things which I would like to speak to us today. I find in this a model of encountering God, that you can come to God and speak to God as a friend. You can tell him what's in your heart. You can argue with him. It's a back and forth conversation. It requires listening and it requires speaking. I see something else in this passage, that there was a special place set aside, the tent of meeting. There's a place where Moses goes to speak with God. He's in the desert, but in that desert, there's a special place carved out for him to have this conversation. There's a sort of privacy with this, with the do not disturb sign up in the pillar of cloud, where he has this special time to reflect and be in communion with God. But what I also find of most interesting is the movement. Moses is going through the desert, from one place in the desert in the community out to another place in the desert, a place of solitude in the tent of meeting, to be with God. The desert in our tradition speaks volumes. It is vast. We have the history of our desert fathers and mothers, the saints and the hermits that would go into the desert to pray and find the presence of God. They would go in there with their hearts laden with their cares. It is a place that many of us come to. It feels barren. There's no vegetation. It looks brown from a distance. It all seems bleak. But when you move into the desert, there is the brilliant stars and the striation of color and the movement of God, the awesomeness of God's presence. The desert feels like an ancient place, a place where people have trod for millennia. But the desert is also an intimate place where each of us can enter. So I would like to say with you and leave with you this thought, that here in the desert, one's heart is moved by the places where the ancients worked and prayed and toiled and wept. In these desert places, one feels the presence of the Lord amongst all the people, The ancient holy sites speak to us through their very existence. And the places of the desert speak to each of us. And I pray that you find the places where you and God speak, and you are able to tell God your heart's deepest yearnings, greatest grievances, and heartfelt joys. Amen.